Hello everyone, I'm so excited to welcome you all to this very special event, which is going to take us behind the scenes of our OU BBC co-production, Art That Made Us. I'm Dr. Joanna Paul and I'm a senior lecturer in the Classical Studies Department at the Open University, but I'm also one of the Open Media Fellows for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, which means that I work closely with our university's broadcast and partnerships team. Now, at the OU, we've been working in close partnership with the BBC for over 50 years now, making inspirational content that brings learning to life and reaches millions of people in the process, as well as feeding back into the teaching that we offer our own students. We make co-productions across a range of different platforms, including digital, radio, podcasts. But we're here today to talk about our most recent TV co-production, which is Art That Made Us. Now, this has been an 8-part series which spans some 1,500 years of British creativity. And it sets out to tell a kind of alternative history of the British Isles through art and culture. It has some 78 key works of art, literature, music, and much, much more, which take in everything from Cheerhoard to Stormzy. Now, we've been really, really proud and excited about how warmly received this series has been. And so today's event is really something of a celebration of the co-production, in which we want to find out a little bit more about how the series was made. But we also want to delve a little bit deeper into some of the bigger questions that it raises. So asking things like, what can studying the art and culture of the past tell us about today? What kinds of messages can we get from looking at that kind of creative history? And particularly importantly, why is creativity so important to the functioning of a healthy society? Now, to help us delve into these questions, I'm joined today by an excellent panel of contributors. So we have with us Russell Barnes, who is one of the directors and the executive producer of Art That Made Us. And I'm also joined by 3 of my colleagues who have worked as academic consultants on the series. So I'd like to introduce Professor Sarah Haslam from our English and Creative Writing department, and a professor of 20th century literature. Dr. Gemma Allen, a senior lecturer in early modern history, and Dr. Amy Jane Barnes, a staff tutor in art history. So hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. But I'm going to start with you, Russell, and I'd like to really go right to the beginning of this series and to see if you could tell us a little bit about really how and when the original idea for Art That Made Us arose, and what were you setting out to achieve with the series?
Sure. So it all began in 2018. I was developing an idea for BBC Arts about the nature of creativity. And we just made, as a company, a series called Oceans Apart with James Fox, the art historian, in which we'd looked at the art of the Pacific, but we'd also had indigenous artists speaking directly, unmediated, about their own work. And it just created a very, a really engaging way to look at the art of their art in dialogue with the art of the past, and really hear from their experience directly. And so we had this idea of, well, let's try and get artists of today to engage directly with British history, with art from British history. And at the same time this was happening in 2018, another company, Menace, had just finished Civilizations, and wanted to do British civilizations, and the BBC thought they'd put the 2 teams together because there's such synergy between the projects, and we did a kind of to make a kind of history of British art for this would be now 2019, and then we finally got the commission in 2020 and got going.
Thank you. So yeah, that gives us an impression of how there's quite a long kind of genesis in making a series like this, which is really interesting to hear about. And I suppose over that long period of developing it, I'm kind of interested to hear a little bit more about how you arrived at, what is a quite distinctive kind of look and feel for art that made us. There are things about it, whether it's its use of contemporary music or the way in which it brings in, sort of performers, some quite well-known faces that really make it stand out. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about what your thinking was, behind, for example, as we can see here, I think we've got a shot of Michael Sheen, who was, one of my favourite bits of episode 1, for example, with his great performance. What was your sort of objective in interweaving this sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was always our aim to try and look at art afresh and the history of art afresh, and so we really wanted to shift the tone of the landmark form. So obviously, the first step was not to have a single author, to have many voices, to have real sense of discursiveness, and a sense that this is not a kind of top-down single narrative from a single author. That was really important to us. So that's why, obviously, we're thinking about engaging with artists and academics, and really, hopefully, generating a sense of debate and discussion. This is not an attempt to be definitive. Then around that, the other things that occurred to us, it'd be also good to be playful. Therefore, with the style of the whole thing, so colourful graphics that aren't too fusty and traditional, and music as well that's a bit anachronistic at times. Deliberately playing with some knowing references, and making you think. Well, of course, the past was the present once. There was a sense in which it is. At the time people were creating it, it was their time, so I think it really freshens things up to have modern music, contemporary music playing there, and makes you realize it's not so very different. The preoccupations, the concerns are the same as today. In terms of performances, that's a really interesting thing. It wasn't, when we set out back in 2020, something we really thought about. How do we bring literature to life? How do we bring it off the page and make it live? And there's so much literature as well. We realized really quickly that a heck of a lot of the series was going to be poems and plays and novels, and so it really occurred to us that a great way to do that is to use brilliant actors, and Michael Sheen is a great example, Jason Isaacs in episode 5, and many others, and they really help us bring the literature alive. And what was great about it as well, we really refined which excerpts we wanted to cover, and then of course had the academics and studio interviewees around them dissecting and analysing those excerpts, so you could really play off the energy of the performance and the analysis. And I think that some of the most successful bits of the series for me are this interplay. Michael Sheen, talking about Gododin, and then the academics really helping you understand the meaning of the whole poem. And the other thing, of course, is that a brilliantly intelligent actor like Michael Sheen and several others also talk about the work themselves, and it's a really interesting perspective to have the actor who gives voice to literature talking about the literature.
Absolutely, yeah. And you've kind of talked very nicely there about that interplay between the performance and some of the other people who appear on screen as the kind of the academic contributors. So that leads me on nicely to my next question, and I'd like to bring in Gemma, who some of you may have spotted was one of the on-screen contributors for episode 3. So Gemma, I wonder if you could just give us your perspective on that and tell us a little bit about the experience of being interviewed for that episode.
Yeah, well, I was absolutely thrilled to be able to contribute to episode 3, and very grateful to Russell and the team for allowing me to do that. We filmed my interview and interviews for that episode during one of the lockdowns, and that added a certain level of or a certain memorability, I think, to the proceedings for me, because obviously we were adhering very closely to social distancing, and so when I went in to record, they had the whole studio all set up, but it was the way it was set up was the light was on where the contributor was sitting, and the rest of the studio was all dark. And because keeping to social distancing rules, I was sort of introduced to people that were in the room, but they were in the sort of shadowy corners of it. So I was sort of gestured, there's the camera people and there's the sound people. But because it was all dark apart from where I was sitting, and because we had to strictly stay apart, it was sort of these shadowy figures around me, which added a certain flavour to proceedings. And then something that I found really interesting, which I hadn't done before, which was the way it was filmed. And Russ was talking a bit about this film, but the sort of interviews directly to camera. I'd done interviews before where the interviewer was sort of just to the side of the camera, but the way that this was filmed, they had a very clever contraption that sort of projected the face of the director that was doing the interview sort of in front of the camera. So it was a sort of a face floating in front of you. They weren't sitting directly there. You were looking at this sort of reflection of them. So the sort of combination of this dark room with these shadowy figures around us and this sort of reflected face of the director's interview made it, as I say, a very memorable experience. But it was a lovely thing to do, and particularly during a lockdown when you've been working from home for a long time, to be able to go and talk about 16th century creativity was a real joy.
I'm sure. And yeah, that's such a fascinating insight into what that very particular experience of making a TV program during a pandemic must have been like. And that's something we might want to come back to a bit later with some of our questions. We'll be happy at any point to field questions from anybody watching now. I can see that we've got people joining us from all over the country. We've got people from Northamptonshire, London, Warwickshire, with West Midlands, Lincolnshire, Cumbria, Bedford and Manchester, and all over the UK. So do let us know if anybody's joining from further afield, and if you have any questions. Sharon in London's told us, for example, that she particularly loved the bringing to life of Chaucer's Wife of Bath, which was something, really stood out for me as well, and was a particularly memorable performance in one of those early episodes. So Gemma, actually, perhaps we could ask a similar question of you. Do you have a particularly favourite story or object or artwork that really stands out for you from the series?
It's such a difficult one, isn't there? Because there's just so many to choose from. But if I was really pushed, I would have to go for something from the 16th century. And I think I'd probably go for the Mary Queen of Scots embroideries, because they're just so very interesting, because you have to decode them. And you look at these embroideries, which just seem very nice and potentially quite quaint, but as soon as you start decoding them and looking at them and thinking, okay, right, so she's embroidered a ginger cat toying with a little grey mouse, and you start thinking, well, is this a commentary on her relationship with Elizabeth I? Is Elizabeth I meant to be the ginger cat? Another one where she does it of a phoenix. Is this a commentary on Mary Queen of Scots as a phoenix rising again? Why does she embroider a barren vine being cut to make place for a fruitful vine? All these things, as soon as you start decoding them, they're such rich objects. And we know that decoding isn't just something that's nice for us to do. We know it's something that people engaging with these embroideries at the time did. They were meant to read the code in the embroideries. So I love them for that reason. I think I also love them because embroidery and Mary Queen of Scots embroidery is connected to the creativity of other women. So the creativity of women within her own time, and then within the 16th century, we know lots of other women were creative with the needle. Elizabeth I, for example, she was a very skilled needlewoman. She created a shirt for her brother. She did these really lovely book cover she embroidered for Catherine Parr. So we know that this connects Mary Queen of Scots with other women. It connects it with women of other social orders with their own time. But also focusing on the needle, I think is interesting because it connects Mary Queen of Scots to women across history, and I think that's something that the series does beautifully. I mean, we have the Bayeux Tapestry earlier on in the series, and the series makes a point of linking Mary Queen of Scots to suffragette embroidery. So I think if I was pushed, I would go for those embroideries, but it's a difficult choice to make.
It's such a difficult choice, but thank you for talking so lovely. It's such a lovely way about that example, because for me, yeah, that's another really standout one as something that I didn't really know anything much about, and I really appreciated the way that the series kind of shone a light on these quite sort of perhaps lesser known objects. So, Russell, I'd like to come back to you actually to ask a little bit more about this process of selecting the content. So,
Yeah.
Gemma was really pleased that we had, this one thing that she really wanted to see there. But you had this challenge of how to whittle everything down, for the 8 episodes that you ended up with. And you've given us some really great sort of statistics that give us a sense of what the scope of the series actually was. So I've already mentioned that there was about 78 sort of key artworks. And you also mentioned that, for example, you had 108 different filming locations across the 4 nations, interviews with 56 academics, and over 80 artists, performers, writers, and curators, which include 4 Turner Prize winners, 1 poet laureate. So it's such an incredibly rich array of material. How on earth did you work out what would make the final cut?
Yeah, a very good question. I mean, obviously it's an extraordinary privilege to think, gosh, let's do British history through art, and right, where do we start now? It's with a blank sheet of paper. Very early on, we realised we couldn't be comprehensive. This is not going to be a comprehensive trawl of British art history. So we focused on with the BBC, we discussed kind of looking at moments of turbulence, moments where, if you like, there was a cultural reset, where, because of, let's say, the Reformation, you get a real shift in ideas, in values, in media, and therefore you can trace that rather than doing, say, the Tudors. So that's the first thing. So we narrowed it down then. Then we also narrowed down those moments with a theme. So the Reformation, again, as an example, rather than doing the whole Reformation, huge subject as well, we narrowed it down to Elizabethan Reformation mostly. And so that helps a bit. And then obviously then the filters come on. We'd start talking to our wonderful consultants at the OU and other consultants that we have on the programme. And we started really looking at balancing what are the really important artworks that really change things, that really symbolize the changes going on underneath this reset that we're talking about. But also applying some filters, thinking about, look, we really want to represent the diversity of Britain. We really want to have artworks from the different nations. We really want to make sure different minorities are in there. There are also some surprising, overlooked items, not just the greatest hits. So it was a careful balance. I mean, there's a lot of debate, as you can imagine, a lot of working through. And of course, there are things that aren't in there that some people will think, well, why on earth isn't Dickens in there? All the stuff. But our feeling was to try and find things that would really say something about a shift at a particular time, at a particular moment, and about which there was a new thing to say. And then the last thing I'd say, the last filter, if you like, was the artists themselves. So we were always, looking for artworks that still inspired, engaged contemporary artists, because that's obviously the absolute key part of the format, is this sense of contemporary artists engaging with the artworks of the past. And so we were looking for artworks, from their biographies, from their social media, things that they are really excited about. And obviously then looked at our kind of Uber list and narrowed it down again from there. So it was a very long process, a lot of work involved in it. But great fun, obviously,
Yeah, so as you've said, that was something that involved our team from the OU from quite an early stage. So if I could come to you now, Sarah, to ask you a bit about what that process was like for you as one of the collaborators from that early stage. What sorts of things were you able to feed back to Russell and the rest of the production team as that process of developing content went on?
Thanks, Joe. I mean, it's a great question, and I suppose the first thing I'd say in response is that the collaboration was enormous fun, particularly at the beginning. And picking up on something that Russell was saying at the beginning, it was a wide open space. It felt to us. I think that obviously some refining had already happened by the time the production team brought us in, but we were encouraged to think big. We were encouraged to bring our ideas from our research, to talk about people we'd heard speaking, random things we'd found interesting, we thought might fit in. So it really was expansive in those early conversations. I remember one of the suggestions I made was a book that I fell in love with, and it was published in 1902. It was a wonderfully eccentric novel called The Lunatic Golfer and His Cycling Wife. You don't find it on many syllabi these days. It's a wonderful book, and that came up in relation to conversation about suffrage, about emancipation, about the new woman. And so we generated in our collaboration these ideas, and then there had to be a reining in, there had to be a refining down, and that happened during those early meetings. But I like to think, and based on what Russell says, this is the case. I like to think that those big ideas, those enthusiasms, found a way into the way that will help to shape the series, how it developed in its openness, in its expansiveness. Later on, we read drafts and offered comments on them. We watched the early versions of the episodes again, sending comments back to the production team for them to consider. We helped to fact check where we could as well. And one of the things I think all three of us were reading in mind particularly was diversity. Again, picking up on something that Russell said, wanting to sort of ensure as much representation of the nations, say, for example, as we could, supporting that aim of the series. And I really think it is one of the outstanding aspects of it, its range, its reach, extraordinary. So great collaborative endeavor, really good fun, and it was a pleasure to work with the team.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to hear you say how much fun it was. I mean, I know from watching from the sidelines, it always seemed to be, something that was really stimulating and hard work, but also, brilliant to be able to get stuck into it. Amy, I'd like to ask you as another member of the academic team, whether there are any other sort of things that you contributed to the project, any other sort of aspects of your involvement around the series that you could tell us about today.
Yeah, sure. So, like with many OU co-productions with the BBC, we put together some additional resources to sit on the on our website. We're really keen to give voice to some less well-known creators, people who don't feature in the series, but we felt that they were a good fit with the wider narrative of the series. And so we chose 9 women creators from around the 16th century right through to the 20th century, from art, from literature, from architecture, who all made significant contributions in their own time, but perhaps have been overlooked in the present. And if people go to the resources, they can click on each image, which has a lovely portrait by the illustrator Olivia Waller, and they can read a little bit more, a bit of biographical information about each of these women that we feel should be better well known.
Yeah, and it's such a great resource. So I would urge people to check it out. And at the end of today's broadcast, we'll have a web link that can direct you to go and find out a bit more about those 9 women if you're interested. Because it's a brilliant thing to delve into for sure. So we've got people telling us in the chat about some other aspects of the series that they've been enjoying. Joanna in Bedford told us that she particularly loved learning about medieval art through the series. And so I guess that's another good sort of opportunity to pose that same question. And this time I'm going to put it to you, Sarah, for you to tell us a little bit about what your sort of standout object or maker from the whole series was.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to be really cheeky and I'm going to try and talk about more than one very quickly, because I did want to flag the reading of Pearl, which I thought was amazing, beautiful, the original. I was totally blown away by that performance, and also the William Orpin segment has a special place for me, simply because that comes closest to my research in the series. And William Orpin's painting and the way he was trying to ask questions in paint about what you could do with the First World War resonates with me in the work that I do on soldier writers about the First World War, and how they try to put into words what the war had meant to them in their experiences of it. So that was fascinating for me, learning about Orpin's different way of approaching those questions and his different answers, of course, using that medium. But I have to focus on, in a real answer to your question, Julian of Norwich. She, for me, was just, she's such a refreshing and radical voice, very far from where I work now as a 20th century scholar. But she sent me back, the mention of her in this series sent me back to my copy of Revelations of Divine Love, which I bought when I was a student. And one of the quotes that I'd underlined was, "God is as really our mother as he is our father." I just thought, wow, when I read that, in terms of its gender politics, its challenge to accepted notions of religion. And that's pretty groundbreaking now, let alone, for heaven's sakes, in 1373. So I've always wished that she could be known better, and I think that, big shout out to the production team that she's going to be known better now. She already will be, and I hope others who have seen the series have really enjoyed learning about her as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. And actually that kind of ties into some of the comments that are coming through on the chat about how watching an episode has sort of prompted people to go back to literature or an artwork or something that they might have encountered a really long time ago, and perhaps, being sort of encouraged to visit it anew. So we've had a comment from Joanna telling us that, for example, she'd read Jane Austen and Mrs. Gaskell back in the past, but the series really made her kind of want to go to them and read them again, and perhaps with a new sort of perspective after having seen what happens with them in the series. So
Wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we
Wonderful.
can. It's great to hear, isn't it? I think that's what we all want these sorts of programs to do, is to encourage people to go back to the material themselves too, and to think about it in new ways. So yeah, I think we can forgive you for choosing more than one object or item here, because as we've said, there is such a rich array of stuff across the series. It is almost impossible to choose. But the one person who hasn't yet answered this question is Amy, and I am going to see if you can choose just one, but it's fine if there's more than one. What would be your standout bit of the series that you'd like to tell us about?
Oh, well, that's really difficult to pin down, really. But I suppose something that had particular resonance for me was the section that looked at Barbara Hepworth and had Ryan Gander responding to her work. And those lovely images from Snape Malting showing her family of man sculptures. And having grown up in Suffolk and now living back in Suffolk, they are something that I'm very familiar with, but hadn't really looked at before. And really thought about. And so the episode in which they were featured, episode 7 last week, really helped me think about them a little bit more, and I found out more about Barbara Hepworth as a sculptor. But what I think is really nice about that section is that you have the artist who is responding to the artwork that's being featured in the series, whose work is already shown in juxtaposition with the sculptures. So unfortunately, not at the moment. If you go to Snape Malting's, the family of man sculptures have actually been sent to Amsterdam on loan, but I'm sure they will be back. But normally you can see Ryan Gander's statue installation featured alongside the Barbara Hepworth sculptures. So I think, that's really one of the real strengths of the series, and that we can see all these resonances as well between our, it really helps to bridge the gap between past and present, those kind of creative encounters with the objects featured, and highlights those kind of resonances between past and present really effectively, I think. And makes it really clear that there's lots that we can learn, good and bad, from things that happened in the past. And of course, having seen reactions on social media, I think a lot of episodes particularly resonated with people. I mean, obviously the episode on the Black Death, we all now have experience of living through a global pandemic, and I think we can now empathize with that period of history better than perhaps we would have done before. And the other thing that, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to talk about it really briefly. I'm sorry, Joe, but the other thing that really struck me while I was watching the episode where Platon was talking about the portrait of Cromwell, and we also saw his image of his portrait of Vladimir Putin, which, when that was filmed, we couldn't possibly have known what sort of import that might have at the present time when that episode was broadcast. So yeah, lots of food for thought, I think, and that's been
absolutely.
a really reaction to it on social media as well, and from people who have passed on their comments about the series.
Yeah, no, it really has, and yeah, it's great that you've kind of given us so many brilliant examples from the series there, and calling to mind lots of fantastic things, which, although we're not able to show you pictures of all of them as part of today's discussion, do remember that this is on iPlayer, and anybody who still needs to catch up with episodes or wants to watch it again, it's all available to go and kind of dig into. So yeah, I'm so struck by what you were saying about those creative encounters and what they can do for viewers. And again, we're sort of hearing from people watching today that that's something that really did resonate for lots of viewers of many different episodes. So just to give you one example, Sharon in London tells us that she really enjoyed hearing particularly about Mark Quinn as an artist who was sort of responding to and analysing the Richard II paintings, and that it really made her want to go and then see that artifact in the flesh. So I think you're right that those encounters, offer a sort of really fresh kind of critical pair of eyes on these sort of, sometimes well-known, sometimes not so well-known artworks from the past. So Russell, could I come to you actually and just ask you to say a bit more about how you developed these pairings, because again, you had such a rich array of material that you could work with. How did you decide who to put with who, and what were you really setting out to achieve with some of those encounters?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, fundamentally research. So really looking for the artists who still respond, who are still inspired by these works from the past, are influenced perhaps, or doing work in that vein. So, example, Richard II. There, we also interviewed Chris Levine, who's a royal photographer, who took an amazing picture of the Queen about 10, 15 years ago. And that was an interesting perspective, almost, looking at royal portraiture through the ages. And then I think, what we wanted with the encounters was really that sense of an artist coming face to face with an artwork. That was really important. And we didn't want to always do that in museums. So, which has a more traditional feel. We wanted to reinvent the landmark. So, with a more playful tone, I suppose. So often, I mean, you'll see through the series, we tended to kind of print out posters and postcards of these kind of historic works, and then have artists pinning them up. So Platon, you're talking about with Cromwell, Rita Duffy with Tears of Ireland, Chris Levine with Richard II, and many others. And And I think Shelley Rhys-James with Sickert was the other very powerful one. She's pinning up the pictures of these Camden nudes from the 19th century. And that's a kind of bit of a repeated refrain, but it was such a valuable way for us to give space for the artist to really be, putting these pictures up and pondering and reflecting and then comparing to their own work if they're in their own studio. That felt like a really powerful mix to us, to talk about, if you like, the legacy, the handing on of this creativity through the ages to these new artists, the new generation of artists who... sorry, my phone's going. These new artists who are taking on the same ideas and values.
Yeah, absolutely. I can let you let you get that if you need to. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. It was something. It strikes me actually that it wasn't just a kind of a playful element of the series, but actually something, as I think you're indicating, incredibly powerful. By bringing these artists sort of face to face with things from the past. And it strikes me as well that it's partly about a legacy that gets handed down from past to present, but it's also very much about how, that tradition is then very kind of actively engaged with, and perhaps sort of reshaped and challenged or subverted. It's much more than just sort of looking at these canonical works and sort of, saying how great they are, which, I think is something, it's a kind of a message that the series really establishes really firmly. So as we're sort of moving on to think about some of the bigger issues that we can delve into from Art That Made Us, another aspect that really comes through for me when we're thinking about those creative encounters is that it seems, I think, that in the series, we get a sense of how that process of making, that process of creativity is really just as important, if not more important, than looking at the finished artifact or text. It really redirects attention to a much sort of broader sweep of things than just, an object in a museum. And Gemma, I was wondering if that was something that resonated for you as well.
Yeah, I think that's something that the series does so well is takes a much more broader approach to what is art. So as you say, looking at the process of creating something, looking at the process of making something, but also not just fixating on what we might call sort of high art, really taking that broad approach, and that allows the series to really engage with a much broader range of creators. And I think that's so important. We've heard a bit about this already, but it's such an important element of what the series does. So it allows women as creators to really have an important role, and we've heard a little bit about that already, but it's a real strength of the series, thinking about Marjorie Kemp, Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth I, all as women as creators. I think is something that's so important, is such an important aspect of the series. But also taking that broad approach allows us to think a bit more about audiences and different types of audiences, and when certain audiences would engage with art. And I think for me that comes through very strongly in the section on Fox's Book of Martyrs, his Acts and Monuments, which is probably got a claim to being one of the most important books published during the 16th century. And when you look at that work, yes, the text is so important. Of course, it's important. But what the series does so well is also look at the images. And the images were absolutely central to the success of Fox's Book of Martyrs. I mean, they're much, much more detailed images than you would usually get in works of this time. And as I said in the episode, we know these are the bits of the book that which we're particularly engaged with, because they're the pages which are really the most worn in all of the surviving books we've got. So by taking that broader approach to art and to creativity that the series takes, I think it really allows us to engage with a really broad range of creators, and also to think about different types of audiences for art.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's such a great example to flash up there. And what I really appreciated when you spoke about it in the episode and then, again, just now, is that you really focused attention on it, not just as a text with, kind of content and images and words, but as a physical artifact itself, right? As a book, which is important itself as an object. And you can sort of see those traces of how it gets read and where it's kind of most heavily used and really, yeah, like you say, summoning up that sense of an audience that might perhaps be overlooked typically.
Jo, can I come in there, Jo? Because I was
absolutely.
just remembering when Gemma was talking, I was really remembering what you say in the episode, Gemma, about there being bits of food stuck in the margins. Now it's like the equivalent of popcorn. In there, there's such gruesome images as well. So there's the kind of the shock of thinking about somebody enjoying them to that extent that you would want to eat something, munching as you're reading. But yeah, I think follow up on what you're saying, Jo. That was a really strong part of that discussion about that, the Fox's Book of Martyrs as well. Fox's Book of Martyrs and popcorn.
Yeah, and again, just really sort of shedding light on those little known aspects of the kind of texts and artworks is so fascinating. So if I could stay with you actually, Sarah. So Gemma's been talking a little bit about how that particular story was helpful in sort of shedding light on little known creators, but particularly audiences. And I know you've had some thoughts on other ways in which the series kind of offers a much needed challenge to some of our assumptions and to some of the sort of accepted narratives that we typically have. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's related to some of the ideas that have come up already, but there's one phrase that I'm not sure we've heard yet, which is the concept of the master narrative, and we've heard about it in the sense of top-down history. And when you challenge history from the top down, and that could be about wars, it could be about kings and queens, it could be about cultural objects. But when you challenge history from the top down, you're striking a real blow against the sense of the master narrative. And I think the gender there is important because so many of the challenges to the master narrative that we have in this series are from women creators and women makers. And related to that really is the idea that, the whole process of ascribing cultural value is a political act. So those of us who make decisions about what is valuable sometimes need to have those decisions challenged, and how better to kind of be part of that process, be part of that debate, than provide televised oxygen in a way to the lesser known makers in the way that this series does. And to go back to the earlier discussion about the pairings, I think that this was also a really good illustration of that, the way that even if the original influencing object was iconic already, so like Othello, for example, the fact that modern day makers, with their take, with their voice, with their experience, with their new voice, was engaging and remaking that work and being shown to remake that work in the series was a wonderful way of again providing that sort of oxygen, that challenge to the sense of a master narrative, and not just the objects that feature in it, but the way that we understand them, the way that we appropriate them, and the way we sometimes have to let them go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that idea of the kinds of things that give oxygen, to some of this material and help us to look at it in a different way. And I know, again, some comments that have been coming in the chat, sort of the particular pairings and sort of encounters that have really resonated with different viewers. So, for example, somebody telling us that they particularly enjoyed the matching up of Jeremy Deller and William Morris, as a really sort of unexpected pairing. And as a big fan of William Morris myself, that was something I really enjoyed as a way of just shedding new light on it, I think. Great, thank you, Sarah. So do send in any questions if anybody wants us to answer anything, put a question to any of the panel in the short time that we have left. Something else I would just like to ask in the meantime, and I'm going to put this to you, Russell, if that's okay. We heard a little bit at the beginning from Gemma, sort of about experience of filming and some of the challenges that were introduced by the pandemic. As somebody, you know, sort of with oversight of the whole thing, I'm assuming that you had also some moments of particular challenge and difficulty that experience, you know, sort of you know, caused by the pandemic. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about anything, unless it's stuff that you're all just sort of trying to, you know, forget about and sort of, you know, consign to the distant past.
I mean,
how on earth did you get it made, I guess?
Yeah, no, it was extraordinary. I mean, I think we were in our office. I think right at the beginning I mentioned that we just started working in 2020, beginning of 2020. So we were in office for about 3 or 4 months, and then the pandemic struck, and so immediately we had to abandon our office. So yeah, it made everything hard, and we were kind of learning how to Zoom at the same time as learning about you know, the British art history. It was an amazing experience, but you know, we got there in the end. But it took 2.5 years, you know, 2.25 years to really to get through it and get everything we needed in the can. You know, a lot of sequences were set up, then fell down. A lot of people, you know, I think there are some people who I'd not met who worked on the production, you know, which is extraordinary when you think about it over 2 years, you know, but it's just the way it had to be. Everything was remote. And sadly, there were also contributors who we desperately wanted to film with and weren't able to in the end. There was one example, David Adjei, we were in touch with very early on. Really keen for him to do something about architecture in the series. We were thinking about Westminster Hall, hammer beam roof. And he was stuck in Accra, where he was building a cathedral. So, you know, very productively stuck. But you know, he just couldn't get back to Britain. We couldn't fit it into the schedule. So, you know, there are all the way through. There are things that could have happened differently, but COVID got in the way. I hope at the end of the day, you know, it doesn't feel like that. You know. And there's, you know, there's plenty of lovely stuff in there. But yeah, it was a challenge.
Yeah, well, no, I think it absolutely doesn't feel like COVID got in the way when you watch the finished thing. I mean, it's all testament to the production team, you know, just how much you managed to do under such difficult circumstances. So you've said there, you know, yes, there were some things where you would have liked to have had contributors and the pandemic put a stop to it. But I just wanted to return to sort of one of the earlier themes that we were talking about. I think it was Sarah, when you were telling us about your favourite object, you or perhaps earlier than that, you were talking about, you know, some of the ideas that you fed in the earlier stages of collaboration, you know, the sort of random novel about the golfer and the cyclist that never made the cut. So I kind of would like to throw that question out to the rest of the academic team, or indeed, if you have anything else in mind, Sarah, are there any other sort of, you know, ones that got away, particular things, or, you know, perhaps areas or themes that you feel could have been explored, but that there just wasn't space for them?
I suppose I have one which is very unfair because it is in there. So I spoke a lot to the production team about translation in the 16th century, and it's absolutely in the episode because there's that wonderful section on the Bible in Welsh, which is just wonderful. Had that one episode been a sort of 8-part series, then, you know, I would have loved to have had some more on translation, because I think people often think that translation is quite a sort of formulaic, boring act. But actually, it can be quite revolutionary if you're not just translating word for word, you're translating for the spirit of the piece. And in the 16th century, there's a lot of discussion about how you do translation. And what's really interesting is there's a small group of very learned women who undertake translation at this time. And when they go with the spirit of the piece rather than word for word, you get some really, really interesting work coming out. And I've written a little bit about one Tudor translator on the OU site that accompanies this series. But I'm aware that, you know, I would have loved to have had a bit more on Anne Bacon and other female translators, but I'm aware where there is already translation in the 16th century episode, and it's only an hour long. So it's this question of what you can include and what you can't include. So it's a very unfair comment from me there, really.
No, not at all. But it's interesting to hear, where some of the kind of story might have gone, had time not been an issue. And yeah, that strikes me as a really important area that, hopefully your comments today will help people to sort of go away and perhaps reflect on that a little bit more. I suppose another question that comes to mind, which is also kind of informed by the pandemic, although not so much in terms of the sort of operational challenges of getting this made, but when we're thinking about this sort of, engaging with a history of British creativity and the different sort of works of art and literature that are shown to us in the series, I'm interested to know if there are ways in which our experience of the pandemic also then affects the way in which we think about those artworks or texts or whatever. So not just in the obvious way that I think Amy mentioned earlier in terms of, if we think back to the period of the Black Death, we perhaps come at it from a different perspective now. But for example, Sarah in particular, I know that a lot of your research concerns the way in which people use and read and engage with literature, in a kind of a therapeutic sense, right? So is that something that for you also sort of played into what you saw in the series and the way in which people relate to different texts?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that's an angle of art and the value of art that if there'd been another 10 episodes, maybe it would have been wonderful to kind of dive in there a bit more, because I think the therapeutic value of music, of painting, of as well as of literature, which is what I know most about, is huge. And the what people were going through during COVID just refined that sense and made it incredibly keen. I mean, Bill Gates started predicting the death of the book 10 years ago, didn't he? How wrong he was. And it's not just Kindle, it was the printed book that resurged during COVID, because people were finding comfort and familiarity. They were finding social bonds that they weren't getting anywhere else in the world of a novel. So I think that at the time of this series being put together, it's astonishing how much of a kind of a keen, a laser view was on art and its value, and how it helps to keep us all sane. Not just, I think, better human beings, but also literally sane.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Sarah. A question that's come in from the audience today, from Sharon, who wants to thank you all for making such an ambitious and enjoyable series. And she says it's converted several non-art friends of hers. And she has a question which I think we must put to Russell, which is she wants to know how those modern music choices were made. So you touched on that briefly at the beginning, but I know that has been a really memorable aspect of the series for lots of people. Like you say, those sometimes quite unexpected and anachronistic pairings. Can you talk us through that process a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so it would be done in two stages, I suppose. Firstly, by director, perhaps as they imagine a sequence in a cathedral, or so they've got a kind of a track in mind or an idea in mind. So there's a bit of that going on. But then more commonly in the edit, so with an editor, so you'd be trying different tracks. Often we have, so editors, and directors have, catalogue, if you like, of things they really love and they think work really well with visuals, and then might work for this particular sequence or mood that they're trying to generate. And then it's a trial and error thing. You try things out, and then one example, just to give it a particular example, using Black Sabbath for the Gododin, so the kind of the sirens and the heavy metal, it's screechy metal. I think it really works. It's really not what's expected, and it really kind of shakes you up, I think, when watching that sequence, because you think you don't usually see that artifacts and literature from this period being with that accompaniment. And I think and yet it's right. It feels right. It feels right, the right energy and tone. So there's an example, but that came from the editor. They responded to Michael Sheen's performance. They had this track in mind, thinking about that, and it just seemed to it's War Pigs, I think, by Black Sabbath, just seemed to work incredibly well.
Yeah, I agree. It does work brilliantly. So thank you, and thanks for your question, Sharon. I hope that answers it. Well, we're moving towards the end now, so it seems only right to kind of end with a fairly big question. And I'm going to put this to you, Gemma, if that's okay. Although if anybody else wants to chip in, please do. But it's to ask really the fundamental question of why the story that gets told in Art That Made Us is an important one. Any thoughts?
Well, there's so many answers you could give to that question, but I think it's such an important series because it helps us engage with what were the creative acts which were important to generations before us. What did those generations decide to remember and to capture in art? It tells us something about their humanity, I think. And then I think that has a secondary importance, and particularly at the moment in a time when I think it often feels that the arts and humanities are under attack, and I think that we need to defend the arts and humanities. And when we look at something like this series or the courses that the OU offer on the arts and humanities, it shows us how important it is to engage with what made people human in past generations, what is important in their humanity, what creative acts matter to them. And I think by defending the arts and humanities, we're showing that it's important to understand where we've come from, so we can really understand where we're going to. I think that's just one of the reasons, but I think the reception to this series shows us the thirst for this sort of content, and how people want to engage with the arts and humanities, and how important it is to us as a society.
Absolutely. And yeah, I hope that lots of people watching today and watching the series will have, picked up on some of that sense of urgency, if you like, about the need to engage with this stuff and to keep defending the arts and humanities, as you say. We'd love to hear from anybody watching at the moment. Do tell us in the chat box why you think this is an important story to keep telling, because it's certainly something we all passionately believe in, but it's great to hear from all of you as well. So do keep that conversation going. Well, I think with such a kind of a wonderful summary of, why this is an important story to tell, and given that we're running out of time pretty much, I think we need to draw things to a close. So I've enjoyed immensely talking to all of you about your experience of making the series and working on it and collaborating. It's just been wonderful to hear about. And I think, we are all in agreement that Art That Made Us, it's not only been a really interesting and informative and, really enjoyable series to watch, but also something that has made such a powerful statement about why the arts and humanities matter, why creativity matters, what we can learn through this material about how cultures think about themselves, relate to one another. It's just, there's so much important material there. And I would urge everybody, if you haven't already watched all the episodes, the final one is going out tonight, but it's all there on iPlayer. Do make sure you catch up with all of it when you can. And it also just remains to say that, if these are issues that you have particularly enjoyed thinking about and want to delve into a bit more, then we've got lots of stuff, as Gemma kind of alluded to, at the Open University, which will, take this journey further. There should be a link coming up on the screen in just a moment, which will take you to our website, which is where you can find some of the additional material that our academic team created as a kind of accompaniment to the series. So yeah, please do look at that. It will also provide you with links where you can go and find out much more about what the OU offers in terms of both formal and informal courses and curriculum. And just to end with another comment that's just come in through the chat box, which is a lovely way to end. This is from Soraya, and she says, "It was TV series like this that inspired me to study arts and humanities with the OU during lockdown. Please never stop making them." So, I mean, what an excellent way to end. I think I would like to promise on behalf of everybody here that we will indeed never stop doing what we're doing at the OU, and hopefully Russell too, making such wonderful documentaries, because, you know, they do such a wonderful job. So I'm just going to end by once again thanking all of our guests today. So thank you, huge thank you to Russell and to Sarah, to Gemma and to Amy for joining us. And thanks to all of you for tuning in and for your questions and comments. It's been such a fun hour. So yeah, thank you ever so much, and goodbye.